Hello and welcome to this third video in the series produced for the Reveal project, which is focusing on ethics and values and librarianship and how these can be considered in terms of better advocacy. This third video focuses on CILIPS Ethical Framework and considers how it can aid practice. The Reveal project, for those of you who have not watched any of the videos so far, is focused on reinforcing ethics and values for effective advocacy for libraries. It's funded by the CILIPS Research Fund to enhance collective advocacy across the profession through an accessible framework for library and information ethics and values, presented as a set of continuing professional development tools. And these videos form part of the training materials produced for the project. This is the third video in a series of 10. And it focuses, as I said, on CILIPS Ethical Framework. The previous two videos focus firstly on advocacy and the tools of rhetoric that can be utilised within advocacy. And the second video, which was quite a long video, focused on ethical theories, as well as how these ethical theories have been applied by key thinkers and libraries. Now, beginning with considering codes and social justice theories. So in the public sector, theories of justice, as we discussed in video 2, will govern strategy from elected officials downwards. Therefore, professionals need to understand these theories to be able to practice as well as advocate effectively. And, in terms of today's focus, our professional codes are influenced by these theories. So you see on the right-hand side, the professional knowledge skills base that CILIP produced, and this essentially influences accreditation of courses as well as ethics and values of the profession more generally. So our whole framework of professional practice is built around this knowledge and skills base. Now, ethical codes serve two distinct purposes that make them valuable. Firstly, they provide members of a professional association with a clear model of expected behaviour. Kohler and Pemberton highlight the significance of ethical codes, stating that they go beyond mere symbolism or abstract principles. Instead, these codes establish the boundaries of acceptable conduct and offer professionals a reference point to guide their actions. They also provide support and guidance in navigating conflicts between professional obligations and societal or corporate demands. Secondly, ethical codes effectively communicate a set of values to a broader audience, including employers and other stakeholders. And this aspect is particularly crucial in defining the professional standing of individuals. When the values and principles upheld by a profession are not explicitly stated, it becomes challenging for those outside the profession to fully comprehend the nature of the work and what it contributes to society. Now, Kohler and Pemberton identified essentially 6 universal concerns in 37 ethical codes that they examined. Now, these universal concerns were firstly client and patron rights and privileges, selection issues, professional practice, access issues, employer responsibility, and social issues. Now, in terms of the moral components of codes, in defining the moral components of professional actions, a formal code of ethics may either prescribe or proscribe certain forms of behaviour, or define the outcomes desired by members of a profession as they carry out their responsibilities. And these forms of ethical statements derive from deontological, or otherwise known as duty-based theories, or teleological, purpose-based theories. Buchanan and Henderson say, though, that codes of ethics do not always provide answers, and they of course do not operate on levels of deep specificity. They provide guidelines, not rules, which is probably best, and certainly they are not laws. Now, in terms of the codes of ethics and libraries in terms of the development over the years, the first code for librarians was introduced in 1938 by the American Library Association. It was formed in 1876. In the UK, it took even longer. The Library Association, which now forms part of CILIP, adopted their first code in 1983, and the ALA was formed in 1877. Now, more up to date, the revised ethical framework for CILIP was introduced in 2018. Now, the revised ethical framework contains 7 ethical principles plus guidance that allow you to understand how those principles should be understood, which we'll talk about. And the 7 principles are human rights, equalities and diversity, and the equitable treatment of users and colleagues. 2. The public benefit and the advancement of the wider good of our profession to society. 3. Preservation and continuity of access to knowledge. 4. Intellectual freedom, including freedom from censorship. 5. Impartiality and the avoidance of inappropriate bias. 6. The confidentiality of information provided by clients or users and the right of all individuals to privacy. And 7. The development of information skills and information literacy. And CILIP have produced an infographic which can be used as the form of a poster or postcard just to remind you of what the ethical principles are. It's obviously a shortened version of each of them, but it gives a good idea of what they stand for. So firstly, human rights. And the guidance notes that are provided for the ethical framework say that diversity is about taking account of the differences between people and groups of people and placing a positive value on those differences. This is strongly linked with promoting human rights and freedoms based on principles such as dignity and respect. And the notes remind the reader that as well as being an ethical principle, there are legal elements to rights and equalities too, with the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Equality Act 2010 both cited as providing guidance for practice. In terms of what it means for practice, the notes remind library and information professionals that the principle supports standing for diversity and challenging prejudice, as well as promoting and defending diversity across the workforce. Public benefit. The notes remind readers that public benefit is an important element of the Royal Charter that CILIP has received. The specific focus as such, to work for the benefit of the public to promote education and knowledge through the establishment and development of libraries and information services, and to advance information science. And the notes further emphasise that the principle relates to the good or well-being of society as a whole, and the specific public benefits identified for the library and information professions are health and well-being, literacy levels, education and job prospects, social inclusion and cohesion, and economic prosperity. Preservation. The notes clarify that preservation is an ethical issue because underpinning it is the decisions that need to be made around what materials are kept for posterity and why, as well as how these are stored and handled. In terms of access, the ethical element relates to the opportunity citizens have to utilise the materials. And the notes remind us that the core mission of library and information professionals is to ensure access to information for all. Therefore, due regard should also be given to ensuring continuity of access to preserved materials. Intellectual freedom. The notes begin by some definitions to clarify terms, defining intellectual freedom as the right to access and share information, to intellectual activity and creativity, to expression and debate, and censorship as the suppression of ideas and information that certain persons find objectionable or dangerous on political, religious, or moral grounds. The notes further clarify that in terms of censoring materials, materials should not be restricted on any grounds except that of the law, and that the legal basis of any restriction should always be stated. And this principle is obviously one that is one of the most controversial to uphold, as obviously we've seen recently in newspapers and other press outlets some controversies relating to potential book bans, challenges on books, or books not being made available when people argue they should be. So these are perhaps some of the thorniest areas that librarians can operate in, because they can lead to lots of complaints, and as I said, as we've seen, news reports as well. Impartiality. Again, the notes begin by clarifying terms. Firstly, that impartiality is unbiased, equal treatment of others, and inappropriate bias as value judgments that are not suitable or proper in the circumstances. The importance of reinforcing these themes within professional practice is emphasised, and it's worth considering any differences you might perceive between impartiality and the more controversial topic of neutrality, because again, they are different things, but in some people's minds they might be the same, so it's worth reflecting on what neutrality it might be, and what impartiality it might be, and how they differ. Confidentiality is defined in the notes as a state of keeping or being kept secret or private, and the legal basis of this is reinforced with reference to Article 4.11 of the General Data Protection Regulation. Now, this principle obviously covers confidentiality and privacy, but it's also important to remember that privacy differs from confidentiality and security. Privacy is the overriding concept which involves the right to be left alone and the autonomy to determine with whom we share details of our personal lives or personal information. Confidentiality is a much narrower concept. Violation of confidentiality undermines privacy, but privacy can be achieved without confidentiality, and that you can choose not to share your information in the first place and thereby not entrust others to keep it confidential. So again, understanding the differences between the two things is important. Information skills and information literacy. The importance of being able to find and utilise information well is reinforced in this principle, emphasising the ability to think critically and make balanced judgments about any information we find and use. And the notes further clarify that the development of information skills and information literacy are central for information professionals as we create, curate and enable the use of diverse types of information in an ethical manner. And we have a crucial role in advocating for these skills. The range of contexts in which information literacy is needed are listed, and they are education, the workplace, health, citizenship, and everyday life. Now, we really are in the area here of some of the principles of balancing competing needs. The ethical framework and clarifying notes provide a useful toolkit for practicing library and information professionals, and strongly reinforce some of the key ethical debates we discussed in video 2. Of crucial concern here is how to balance the rights of different people from the point of view of an adherence to human rights, equality and diversity, versus one of the key areas where this can often be challenging to uphold, intellectual freedom. The tensions inherent in this cannot always be predicted in advance, of course, but it's extremely important to acknowledge that a stance whereby material should not be restricted other than on the basis of law may well clash when legally available materials may offend specific individuals or groups. And what's also important to note is this is not a new thing. This is an issue that libraries have faced throughout their history. For instance, in 1978, the then Library Association published a statement reflecting that librarians recognise the need for an appropriate balance to be maintained within the materials which they make available to reflect differing extremes or shades of opinion on matters which might be thought to be contentious. In providing reasonable access to a representative range of published material, a librarian is required to take note of the needs and interests of the public as a whole. So the challenges faced in modern librarianship from so-called culture wars are not new, and the professional dilemmas they present have been ruminated on by librarians for generations before the current generation even faced them. So can we summarise really the challenges we face in practice in terms of how to essentially synthesise CILIPS Ethical Framework? The nuances of how we face challenges may well change based on how society perceives what is at stake, but the ethical questions really do remain the same. What does equitable access to information mean? How can libraries facilitate this? How can libraries provide a service to a diverse population of peoples with differing social, religious and cultural viewpoints? How can librarians resolve tensions when offence is taken at resources that may be legally acceptable but culturally insensitive? How can the profession communicate this complexity in its framework of ethics, both for the profession itself and arguably, just as importantly, the populations we serve? Gorman has said libraries, library services of all kinds, and librarianship are inextricably of the world and cannot exist without context. They are part of and affected for good and ill by the societies they serve, the communities in which they live, the countries in which they exist, and the wider world. Therefore, librarians will always get caught up in wider societal panics, things like culture wars and the like. It's how the profession responds to them both individually and collectively that determines whether professional values are being maintained. And consequently, If it's deemed professional values need to be amended or adjusted for new times, which is perfectly reasonable, this is something that should be debated as a collective endeavour in the gaze of public scrutiny, and even more importantly, communicated clearly and concretely to the people served by libraries. It's one thing for the profession to revisit its values. It's another thing entirely to not communicate that with the public, who may understand our values as being one thing when they are actually now being practiced as another. So in summary, we discussed the background to ethical codes in library and information science. We explored CILIP's Ethical Framework, and we considered how ethics can be managed in a practical sense. In the next video, we will focus in more detail on ethics, privacy, and libraries.